Hello, this video is going to go over Chapter 19, Cardiovascular System of the Heart, Objective 10. So in this objective, we're going to understand how the heart is regulated, both intrinsically and extrinsically, which means you can kind of see a picture of the brain there, real human brain. So you can probably figure out we got some nervous system involvement here in order to regulate the heart. So intrinsic versus extrinsic regulation, what are we talking about here? Intrinsic regulation results from the heart's normal functional characteristics and doesn't depend on any kind of outside involvement. No neural involvement, no hormonal involvement. This is going to function whether the heart's in its place in the body or whether you remove it from the body. So here's the thing with cardiac muscle cells, they naturally beat. And when you get them all together, they naturally beat in unison with each other. It's pretty cool. So they just have that intrinsic regulation to just beat. Now, extrinsic regulation, however, is going to involve some outside control, such as control from the nervous system and or the endocrine system. So neural regulation specifically is resulting from the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. Remember, sympathetic is going to speed up that heart, parasympathetic is going to slow that heart down. Kind of like we said previously, that autonomic nervous system is going to target involuntary muscles like cardiac muscle cells, and they need a gas pedal and a brake pedal. They need a way to speed up, but you also need a way to slow that stuff down again. You can't have your heart beating fast like you're running from a bear all the time. You've got to have a way to slow that down, but you also need a way to speed it back up. So that's the neural regulation. And hormonal regulation is going to come from the presence of hormones such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline, and these are secreted from the adrenal medulla. So during sympathetic stimulation, the sympathetic nervous system is not only going to target the heart itself, it's also going to target the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal medulla, and tell the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine, norepinephrine, which will then go through the bloodstream body-wide until it does reach the heart as well as other organs. When it reaches the heart, it will then tell the heart to speed up. Intrinsic regulation. So there's this thing called the Starling Law of the Heart, Frank Starling Law. It's a relationship between preload and stroke volume. So as blood returns, so keep in mind blood is coming back to the heart. We'll just use the right side for an example. Inferior vena cava, superior vena cava. Blood will then go through those blood vessels and enter into the right atrium. So the end diastolic volume is going to increase. So this is ventricular relaxation. This is when blood is going to be either passively or forcefully pushed into that ventricle, whether it be the right ventricle or left ventricle, and that is going to mean there's going to be more blood in the ventricle because you just got more blood coming into the ventricle. Now, how does the ventricle know there's more blood in it? Well, the ventricles have these sensors in there that allow for stretch recognition. So it recognizes when the ventricles are filled with more blood because the ventricles are now stretched more. So increased stretch of the ventricle walls is noted. This is preload. So if you have more blood in the ventricle, more preload, that is then going to increase cardiac output. So opposite, a decreased preload means a decreased cardiac output. So what I have here highlighted in yellow is the Frank Starling mechanism, which you already know. We're just officially giving it a name. Okay, it kind of makes sense. We're just giving it the Frank Starling mechanism name. Increased preload causes the cardiac muscle cells to contract with greater force and thereby producing an increased stroke volume. So if you have more blood in the ventricles, those cardiac muscle cells are going to be told to contract more forcefully because there's more blood in there. And if they contract more forcefully, it's going to push more blood out, which means you're going to have more blood leaving the heart, and that's called stroke volume. So it kind of all makes sense after what we've talked about previously, but this is the Frank Starling mechanism. Now, let's take a look at extrinsic regulation. Extrinsic regulation. This is the heart is innervated by both parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. You should kind of recognize this. This was something we've taken a look at previously. They influence the pumping action of the heart by affecting heart rate and stroke volume. Extrinsic regulation of the heart keeps blood pressure, blood oxygen levels, carbon dioxide, and pH. Remember I told you there was that relationship between these three that you need to know about, okay? pH and oxygen are going to do the same thing. If one's up, the other one's up. If one's down, the other one's down. And then carbon dioxide will do the opposite. Oxygen's up, carbon dioxide's down, and vice versa. So extrinsic regulation is going to keep homeostasis with these four components. You can see in the picture here, we've got the vagus nerve. That lets you know, oh, vagus nerve, that's parasympathetic. Take a look. It's targeting the heart, telling the heart to slow down. You can see parasympathetic over here is in blue. I believe you've got this picture in your handouts. This one right here, it's still coming from the spinal cord. You're going to have, remember, the sympathetic ganglia, right there it is. And that is going to be the sympathetic pathway. Again, still targeting the SA node, and it's going to tell the heart to speed up. So the heart is stimulated by the sympathetic cardioacceleratory center, and the heart is inhibited by the parasympathetic cardioinhibitory center. So if you look up here, you've got a cardioinhibitory center and a cardioacceleratory center within the central nervous system. Specifically, remember, central nervous system is brain and spinal cord, specifically the medulla oblongata. If you all remember back from chapter 13 where we talked about the functions of the brain, the medulla oblongata, it was involved in a lot of involuntary components such as breathing and heart rate. So the medulla oblongata has got a cardioinhibitory center and a cardioacceleratory center within it, telling the heart when to speed up and when to slow down. So I'm going to let you take a look at this on your own if you want to review the parasympathetic nervous system a little bit there. This right here is a review of the vagus nerve. I'll let you take a look at that on your own. Cranial nerve number 10. Again, a little bit more on cranial nerve number 10. This is I just cut and pasted the picture from when we did cranial nerves from A&P1. I just took that slide and just stuck it in there. Parasympathetic control. So we're going to be following the blue pathway, okay? Parasympathetic nerve fibers travel by way of the vagus nerve. Remember, the vagus nerve is going to go from the brain down the neck all the way to the organs that lie in the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. So this right here is the vagus nerve, and in that you will find axons of parasympathetic nerve fibers. Preganglionic nerve fibers extend from the brainstem, so we're up here, brainstem, medulla oblongata, to the terminal ganglia within the wall of the heart. So those preganglionic nerve fibers, remember with the autonomic nervous system you have a pre and a post ganglionic neuron. So the preganglionic neuron is going to be the long one for the parasympathetic division. And then right here you can see the ganglion, and then this is going to be the postganglionic neuron, and here it is. Here's another one. So notice they're short. They go straight to the organ. Postganglionic nerve fibers extend from the ganglia to the SA node and to the AV node, to coronary blood vessels and to the atrial myocardium. So they're going to the cardiac muscle cells of the atrium. The inhibitory influence on the heart is going to result in a decrease in heart rate. So again, we kind of already know that. If parasympathetic system is involved, that's going to be your rest and digest phase. It's definitely going to slow the heart rate down. Remember the neurotransmitter that was involved in the parasympathetic division? That was acetylcholine. Remember, epinephrine was part of the sympathetic division, acetylcholine was part of the parasympathetic division. It's going to bind to those ligand-gated sodium ion channels that cause cardiac plasma membrane to become more permeable to potassium, which hyperpolarizes the membrane, getting it further away from threshold. So remember our action potential, which you should have seen a review of that action potential at the beginning of this chapter, and hyperpolarization was too much potassium exiting the cells, and that's going to get that heart further away from threshold, causing it to slow down. Again, parasympathetic division is what we're talking about. Now, also extrinsic control, sympathetic division. Remember, this is the speed up division, the fight or flight. Sympathetic nerve fibers originate in the thoracic region of the spinal cord. So again, parasympathetic was going to come from the brain and sacral regions, where sympathetic neurons are going to come from the thoracic region, thoracic and lumbar. These specifically dealing with the heart are going to be thoracic. Then they're going to project to the heart as cardiac nerves. So here we are in the cardioacceleratory center. We're going to follow kind of the green pathway here. Postganglionic nerve fibers innervate these. So we're down here. So this is the sympathetic ganglion. So we've got the pre-ganglion, and then we've got the post-ganglion. So right here, this green one, this is a sympathetic cardiac nerve. But this is going to innervate the SA node, the AV node, same thing as the parasympathetic ones do. Again, you've got to have a brake pedal and a gas pedal, right? If you're telling the SA node to speed up, you better have a brake pedal telling it to slow down. So sympathetic stimulation, remember this is your fight or flight division, is going to increase both heart rate and the force of the muscle contraction. You're engaged in physical activity. You're trying to get more blood flow around the heart. Of course it's going to increase heart rate and force of contraction. Increased stroke volume is going to result from this, causing lower end systolic volume, meaning the heart's going to push out more blood from the ventricle, leaving less blood in the ventricle. That's end systolic volume. Therefore, the heart is going to empty more. So sympathetic control, again, this is similar to what we talked about back in chapter 15. Postganglionic sympathetic neurons secrete norepinephrine. So this postganglionic neuron right here, remember, of all the ones we talked about, this one was the only one that secreted norepinephrine. Every other neuron we talked about back in chapter 15, they all secreted acetylcholine. You can take a look, acetylcholine, acetylcholine, acetylcholine. Remember, that's parasympathetic. They all secrete acetylcholine. But the only one that was the exception was that postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic division. It secretes epinephrine, which is going to tell the cardiac muscle cells to depolarize, which is going to generate that action potential. The specific receptors that norepinephrine acts on in the heart are beta adrenergic receptors. Remember that beta right there? If it's epinephrine is being secreted, it better have a receptor that binds epinephrine, and that's called an adrenergic receptor. And there were two types of adrenergic receptors. We talked about alpha and beta. Specifically on the heart, they are beta receptors. Hormonal extrinsic regulation. So that was the nervous system, parasympathetic, sympathetic. Now let's talk about hormones that affect heart rate. And you all already kind of know these. We talked about these in chapter 17. So epinephrine, norepinephrine released from the adrenal medulla can also increase the heart by increasing heart rate and force of contractions. And I know it's very confusing because we just talked about epinephrine, norepinephrine with the nervous system. So I'm just going to remind y'all, remember, if it's secreted from a neuron, it's called a neurotransmitter. Epinephrine, norepinephrine. If it's secreted from a gland, it's called a hormone. Epinephrine, norepinephrine. So it's the same molecule, it's just where is it secreted from? Are we calling it a neurotransmitter? Are we calling it a hormone? Where did it come from? So there's no different chemically in these two, just where they come from. So that's why now we're calling these same chemicals hormones, because we're dealing with endocrine system now. But the effect on the heart is going to be the same. The secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine is controlled by sympathetic stimulation. Remember, we talked about previously too, glands, whether it be sweat glands, oil glands, adrenal glands, they're not going to do anything unless the nervous system tells it to. They just don't say, oh, gee, today's Wednesday, I feel like secreting some epinephrine today. Let me go ahead and do that. No. The nervous system has to tell the adrenal gland when it's supposed to secrete the epinephrine. So it is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. And when the sympathetic nervous system tells the adrenal gland to, hey, time for you to secrete epinephrine, it will then secrete the hormone epinephrine. It will travel by way of the bloodstream and eventually reach the heart. It is going to be secreted, again, when does the sympathetic nervous system become active? It's during physical activity, right? So increased physical activity, emotional excitement, stress, all of these things are going to engage the sympathetic nervous system, which will then do many things, including tell the adrenal gland to secrete epinephrine. It does take longer to get there, so the epinephrine that comes from the adrenal gland is going to take a minute. It's not going to be an immediate effect. It's got to go through the whole bloodstream and eventually get to the heart. Then the heart will speed up, unlike neural stimulation, which is immediate. So I'm going to let you take a look at some of those questions. Hopefully you've got some in your packet there for question set 10.